6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, in the early spring of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy ruled the Pacific Ocean with an authority few navies in history had ever enjoyed. Their victory at Pearl Harbor had eliminated the American battleship fleet, and subsequent conquests across Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies secured vital resources and immense operational depth. The Japanese strategic situation was defined by unchallenged naval superiority. Admiral Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, believed the moment was ripe to deliver the knockout blow that would force the United States to negotiate a favorable peace. Yamamoto's target was Midway Atoll. Located roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, Midway represented the final forward American base in the Central Pacific. Its capture would force the crippled American fleet to sortie and engage under Japanese terms, allowing Yamamoto to destroy the remaining American aircraft carriers, the true arbiters of modern naval power. Yamamoto believed that if he eliminated the three carriers known to be operational in the Pacific, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, the U.S. Navy would be reduced to irrelevance for at least a year. That year would allow Japan to solidify its vast defensive perimeter, rendering American counterattack impossible. The plan was a masterpiece of complexity and overwhelming force, predicated on one critical assumption, that the Americans remained strategically blind. Yamamoto assembled the largest naval force Japan had ever committed to a single operation. The main striking arm, the first carrier striking force, known as the Kido Butai, was commanded by Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, the same officer who had led the strike on Pearl Harbor. This force alone contained 4 fleet aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carrying 250 of the best, most experienced naval aviators in the world. Supplementing the carriers were 11 battleships, including the colossal Yamato, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. Japan brought nearly 200 warships to the battle. The U.S. Navy could barely muster 75. The American strategy against this Leviathan was based not on material might, but on a single, fragile, and utterly secret advantage: intelligence. In the basement of the administration building at Pearl Harbor, the Navy's Combat Intelligence Unit, known by its code name Station Hypo, worked day and night. The unit was commanded by Commander Joseph J. Rochefort, a brilliant, eccentric codebreaker who had lived in Japan and spoke the language fluently. Rochefort and his team were engaged in the most vital task of the Pacific War, breaking the Japanese Naval Operational Code, known as JN-25B. The JN-25 code was a labyrinth of numbers representing words, phrases, and geographical coordinates. It was protected by a complex additive cipher that made it appear random and impenetrable. Japanese naval doctrine assumed the code could never be broken quickly enough to provide timely strategic warning. But starting in late 1941, working with furious intensity and under immense pressure, Rochefort and his team achieved what the Japanese believed impossible. They did not achieve a full continuous read of the code, but they achieved enough insight, a 10 to 15% break, to discern crucial operational patterns and intent. By May 1942, American intelligence realized Japan was planning a major operation against an objective designated simply as AF. The sheer scale of the preparation indicated AF was a critical target. Early decryption suggested AF might be Midway, but commanders in Washington, primarily Admiral Ernest King, were skeptical. They feared the Japanese might be feinting toward Midway while actually planning a second devastating attack on the U.S. West Coast or an isolated base like Samoa. Rochefort, however, was adamant. Through traffic analysis, monitoring the volume and direction of Japanese naval radio chatter, he concluded that AF was an island base far from the continental U.S. To definitively confirm the target, Rochefort devised a brilliant, simple strategy. He convinced the commander at Midway to send an unencrypted radio message back to Pearl Harbor, detailing a crucial but fabricated emergency. Midway is suffering from a critical water shortage due to a breakdown of the distillation plant. The gamble was terrifying. If the Japanese ignored the message, the Americans would have no confirmation. If they took the bait, they would reveal their entire plan. Hours later, the codebreakers at Station Hypo intercepted a message sent from the Japanese Fleet Command. The partially decrypted text contained the astonishing decisive confirmation. AF reports shortage of fresh water. Attack postponed. Rochefort had the target. AF was Midway. This revelation was the turning point of the Pacific War, though the battle had not yet begun. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, could now violate every principle of naval defense by placing his vastly inferior forces directly into the path of the oncoming Japanese armada. Nimitz knew the exact date, the general location, and the composition of the enemy striking force. The American fleet would not be reacting to an attack. They would be preparing an ambush. The American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, damaged just weeks earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea, steamed secretly toward a point northeast of Midway Atoll, prepared to strike the unsuspecting Japanese carriers first. The stage was set for the ultimate inversion of fortune, a battle where the invisible weapon of intelligence would determine the fate of the Pacific. Armed with the knowledge provided by Commander Rochefort's cryptanalysis, Admiral Nimitz executed a masterful and terrifying operational plan. Against the advice of some cautious staff officers, Nimitz positioned his 3 carriers, Task Force 16 under Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, and Task Force 17 under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding Yorktown, approximately 350 miles northeast of Midway. This location was crucial. It was outside the expected Japanese reconnaissance range, but perfectly positioned to strike Nagumo's carriers just as they were occupied with bombing the island. Vice Admiral Nagumo, commanding the Kido Butai, operated under the fundamental Japanese assumption of strategic surprise. Nagumo was complacent. He believed the American carriers were still near Hawaii or had been deployed to the South Pacific. His operational plan, meticulously following Japanese doctrine, called for a coordinated attack on the air defenses and facilities of Midway Atoll first to clear the path for the invasion forces. After the first strike, he planned to recover the first wave of aircraft, rearm them and refuel them, and then prepare for the expected sortie of the American fleet if they showed up at all. At 4:30 on June 4, 1942, the first Japanese strike wave of 108 aircraft launched toward Midway. They hit the island's defenses hard, but the American planes, mostly obsolete fighters and bombers, had already been launched, thanks to Nimitz's warning. While the Japanese inflicted heavy damage on the facilities, they failed to eliminate the runways. The first critical moment of the battle occurred shortly after the strike returned. Nagumo received conflicting information that triggered a disastrous decision cycle. At 7:15 a.m., just as the returning strike aircraft were landing, an aerial reconnaissance report from a float plane launched from the cruiser Tone reported sighting what appeared to be 10 surface ships, but, crucially, no carriers to the northeast. Nagumo was thus faced with 2 urgent demands: the need to launch a second bombing strike on Midway to ensure the runways were destroyed, as the first attack had been inconclusive, and the potential need to prepare a second strike against the enemy surface ships. Following established, rigid Japanese doctrine, Nagumo ordered the aircraft prepared for the second strike against Midway to be recovered below decks, rapidly rearmed with land attack high-explosive bombs, and launched immediately. But moments later, a second, agonizing report arrived. The reconnaissance float plane corrected its identification. The ships included what appears to be a carrier. This single correction shattered Nagumo's timeline. He now had 4 carriers on his hands, all filled with returning planes, and his reserve planes were already being prepared below decks with the wrong ordnance. To prepare for a surface engagement, he had to bring the planes back up, disarm the land attack bombs, rearm them with heavier anti-ship torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, refuel them, and then launch them.
This was a complex, time-consuming, and dangerous process, made worse by the clutter of fuel lines and explosives filling the hangar decks. At that exact moment, American attack waves launched hours earlier from Enterprise and Hornet, Task Force 16, began to arrive. Spruance had made the courageous and aggressive decision to launch his planes earlier than doctrine suggested, accepting the risk of piecemeal attacks and limited fighter escort to guarantee the element of surprise. The first American planes to hit the Kido Butai were the slow, low-flying Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. These attacks were suicidal and militarily ineffective. The Japanese Zero fighters, operating with exceptional skill, slaughtered the torpedo bombers. In one squadron, VT-8 from Hornet, only one man survived. The torpedo planes did not sink a single Japanese ship, but their sacrifice was immense. They pulled the Japanese Zero fighter cover down to the wave tops, eliminating the crucial high-altitude defense for the next American wave. At 10:22 a.m., the sky cleared and the decisive moment arrived. The Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, having navigated difficult conditions and nearly running out of fuel, arrived unseen high above the Japanese fleet. The Zero fighters were still busy dealing with the torpedo bombers far below. In a concentrated attack lasting less than 6 minutes, the American dive bombers plummeted down. They found the Japanese carrier decks clogged with aircraft, fuel, and ordnance, a catastrophic combination. 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were hit almost simultaneously. Bombs tore through the unarmored flight decks and plunged into the exposed fuel and ordnance-laden hangar decks below. The explosions were instant and devastating. The ships were transformed from naval vessels into blazing pyres. The American ambush had succeeded beyond Nimitz's wildest dreams. 3 of Japan's best carriers were fatally damaged in less than 10 minutes. The fate of the Japanese fleet and the future of the Pacific War was sealed in the 6 minutes between 10:22 and 10:28 a.m. on June 4, 1942.
The destruction of 3 of the 4 carriers of the Kido Butai in a single devastating stroke shattered the offensive core of the Imperial Japanese Navy. However, the battle was not yet over, and the one remaining operational Japanese carrier, Hiryu, commanded by Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, struck back with furious desperation, providing a stark reminder of the tenacity of the enemy. Yamaguchi, recognizing that the battle hinged entirely on sinking the American carriers before his own fate was sealed, launched 2 immediate counterstrikes from Hiryu. These waves aimed directly for the USS Yorktown, which had already been damaged 2 weeks prior at the Battle of the Coral Sea and had been repaired in a miraculous 48-hour effort at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese strikes were executed with skill and precision. The first Japanese dive bomber attack found Yorktown at 12 p.m. 3 bombs scored hits, temporarily disabling the carrier, stopping her dead in the water and setting her ablaze. Japanese pilots mistakenly reported that they had sunk an Enterprise-class carrier, leading to a crucial overestimation of their success by the high command. Damage control teams on Yorktown worked with extraordinary efficiency, and within an hour, the ship was moving and recovering aircraft again. The second wave, consisting of torpedo planes, found Yorktown struggling to recover. Despite fierce anti-aircraft fire and persistent fighter defense, 2 torpedoes slammed into the carrier's port side. The resulting explosions ripped open her hull, ensuring she would not survive. Yorktown was abandoned at 1500 hours, but her sacrifice was complete. She had absorbed the full force of the Japanese counterattack, protecting Enterprise and Hornet. The Americans now knew the location of the 4th carrier. Task Force 16, under Spruance, ordered the final decisive strike. At 1700 hours, dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet found Hiryu and delivered 4 crippling bomb hits. The bombs tore through her flight deck and ignited massive explosions below decks.
Hiryu was rendered a blazing hook, and Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship, a common and symbolic act of defeat among Japanese commanders. By the evening of June 4, all 4 of Japan's best carriers were burning wrecks, the veterans of Pearl Harbor destroyed. The strategic command of Admiral Yamamoto, who had remained 300 miles away with the main battleship force, struggled to reconcile the catastrophic reports. Yamamoto's initial response was to refuse to accept defeat. He ordered the battle plan to continue, believing he could still lure the American fleet into a night surface engagement where the superior Japanese battleships and long-lance torpedoes could redeem the loss of the carriers. However, the reality on the ground, or rather on the water, was undeniable. His primary striking arm was annihilated. Nagumo's 4 carriers, along with 250 irreplaceable aircraft and their highly trained pilots and maintenance crews, were gone. The loss of the air crews was particularly devastating, as Japan had no formalized training pipeline capable of replacing them quickly. On June 5th, Yamamoto reluctantly issued the order to abandon the Midway operation and retreat. He pulled back his invasion fleet and his heavy battleship support, recognizing that without air cover, the force would be annihilated by American air power. The battle had 2 final tragic postscripts. As the Japanese fleet retreated, the crippled Yorktown remained afloat. Salvage teams attempted to tow her back to Pearl Harbor. On June 6th, the Japanese submarine I-168, determined to inflict one final blow, located the abandoned carrier. It fired 4 torpedoes, 2 hit Yorktown, and a third sank the escort destroyer USS Hayman, killing 80 sailors. Yorktown finally capsized and sank on the morning of June 7th. The other final blow involved the Japanese heavy cruisers Mikuma and Mogami, which had collided during the frantic retreat. They were spotted by American reconnaissance and savagely attacked by aircraft from Enterprise and Hornet. Mikuma was sunk and Mogami was crippled, suffering heavy casualties. The Battle of Midway concluded with overwhelming American victory. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and 3,000 men lost, compared to 1 American carrier, 1 destroyer, and 362 men lost. The material superiority of the Japanese had been nullified by the invisible, devastating advantage of intelligence.
The immediate consequences of Midway were profound and permanent. Strategically, the balance of naval power in the Pacific was fundamentally inverted. Prior to the battle, the Japanese enjoyed a numerical advantage in operational carriers, 6 to the American 3, with Saratoga undergoing repairs. After Midway, the forces were equalized, 4 Japanese fleet carriers remaining, matching the 4 American carriers, including Saratoga's eventual return. More critically, the psychological and qualitative superiority Japan had enjoyed since 1941 was completely shattered. The Japanese could replace ships, but they could not replace the 250 highly skilled veteran pilots and aircraft maintenance crews lost aboard the Kido Butai. These men represented the pinnacle of pre-war training and combat experience. The loss crippled the Imperial Japanese Navy's ability to conduct aggressive, offensive carrier operations for the rest of the war. From that point forward, the Japanese Navy was largely fighting defensively, desperately trying to protect its resource lines and rapidly build perimeter. For the Americans, the victory was a massive psychological and operational boost. It provided the necessary time and breathing room to transition from defending their own territory to preparing a sustained counteroffensive. Admiral Nimitz immediately ordered the strengthening of forces around Guadalcanal, recognizing that the shift in momentum demanded immediate exploitation. 2 months later, the Marines landed on Guadalcanal, initiating the grinding attrition campaigns that would define the rest of the Pacific War. However, the secret to the victory, cryptanalysis, remained the most fragile asset. Commander Rochefort, the genius who led Station Hypo, was soon removed from his post. The circumstances surrounding his removal were murky, but largely rooted in professional jealousy and institutional skepticism from superiors in Washington who viewed his unorthodox methods and eccentric personality with suspicion.
Despite saving the Pacific Fleet, Rochefort was denied the Distinguished Service Medal and effectively sidelined for the rest of the war. He did not receive official recognition for his monumental achievement until 1986, long after his death. The need to maintain absolute secrecy over the code-breaking operation, known as Magic, meant that Nimitz could never officially credit intelligence for the victory. He simply attributed to superior planning. The Japanese never realized the true source of their disaster. While they correctly recognized the devastating surprise element, they attributed the success to American luck and poor Japanese execution. This fatal miscalculation meant they never suspected that the JN-25B code was compromised. They continued to use it for several more months, allowing the Americans to read their strategic movements and inflict further damage during the crucial early stages of the Guadalcanal campaign. The Battle of Midway serves as the preeminent example in military history of how intelligence can neutralize overwhelming material superiority. The Japanese brought more ships, more planes, and better pilots, but the Americans possessed the invisible weapon that allowed them to violate the rules of war, turning a potential rout into a perfect, decisive ambush. The fate of the Pacific War was decided not by the physical clash of battleships, but by the silent, relentless work of a small group of codebreakers in a basement in Hawaii. The 6 minutes of tonnage on June 4, 1942, ended the era of Japanese naval dominance, confirming that technology and operational intent, when known, could negate the greatest force arrayed against them. Midway was the high water mark of Imperial Japan and the moment the tide turned definitively toward Allied victory.